Chapter 1. The Dream of a Line Across a Continent. In the middle of the 19th century, the idea of linking oceans by rail sounded like fantasy. Between the industrial cities of the east and the untouched wilderness of the west lay thousands of kilometers of desert, prairie and mountain. But to a generation raised on steam and iron, distance had become an engineering problem waiting to be solved. The earliest surveys were crude. Men carried chains, compasses, and notebooks through terrain that no map described accurately. They worked in extremes of heat and cold, marking river crossings and mountain passes with wooden stakes. Each mark on the paper was the result of weeks of walking, measuring, and arguing over gradients that could decide the success or failure of the line. Behind these expeditions stood private investors, politicians and military officers. They saw in the railway not only trade and migration, but also control. Whoever controlled the tracks controlled the land. For the engineers, it was simpler. They saw geometry and gravity, soil and stone. To them, the world could be understood in numbers. By the early 1860s, competing companies were already pushing forward from opposite coasts of North America. Others were watching closely in Russia, India, and Europe. What united them was a belief that rails could shrink empires and make geography irrelevant. The challenge was not only to build a machine, but to bend a continent to it. Chapter 2. Measuring the Impossible. Survey teams lived rough. They carried their own provisions and relied on local guides for water and shelter. Every mile was mapped by hand. Elevation errors of a few feet could ruin an entire route when locomotives lacked the power to climb steep grades. Rivers posed the first obstacle. Some were shallow in summer and impassable in spring. Others shifted their course from year to year. Engineers had to choose crossings where the soil was firm and the flood line predictable. They learned to read the color of water, the angle of a bank, the pattern of silt. A single wrong assumption could cost months of work. The teams wrote long reports full of precise language, loam over gravel, suitable for timber piles or unstable slope. Recommend deviation of 400 yards south. They worked with slide rules, not computers, and with faith in mathematics more than in luck. As the maps took shape, the routes became political questions. Towns fought to be included. Landowners demanded compensation. Governments argued over subsidies. For the engineers, it meant more surveys, more revisions, more time lost. But when the final plans were approved, they would represent a new kind of national ambition, progress measured in miles of steel. Chapter 3. The Workforce of Nations. When construction began, labor was everything. Tens of thousands of workers arrived, Irishmen fleeing famine, Chinese migrants seeking wages, freed African Americans, veterans of the Civil War, and local tribes pressed into service as guides or hauliers. They did not share language or culture, but they shared exhaustion. Each day followed the same rhythm. Grading crews leveled the ground. Bridge builders followed. Rail layers came last, spiking the iron in a continuous chain that could advance 10 miles in a good day. Accidents were constant. Tools slipped, powder misfired, wagons overturned. There was little medical care and no time to stop. The Chinese workers in the Sierra Nevada used black powder to blast through granite, lowering themselves on ropes to plant charges. Many were killed by falling rock or premature explosions. Irish workers on the plains faced heat and storms that destroyed weeks of progress in a night. Engineers recorded these losses in ledgers without names, only numbers. Food was monotonous: salt pork, beans, bread, coffee. Pay was often late. Yet the work continued, driven by the simple logic that steel must meet steel. For every man who quit, another took his place. The line moved west, then east, until the two ends began to sense each other through the dust. Chapter 4. The Moment of Connection. On 10th of May 1869, at Promontory Summit in Utah, the last rail of the first American Transcontinental line was laid. Newspapers called it the Wedding of the Rails. A special telegraph key was wired to the site so that the message "done" could be transmitted to every major city the instant the final spike was driven. The ceremony was brief but carefully staged. Locomotives faced each other across the joined track, flags hanging from their funnels. Company directors shook hands for photographers. The laborers who had built the line stood behind them, out of focus. Few were named in the reports that followed. The golden spike driven that day was purely symbolic. It was replaced immediately by a standard iron one. Gold was too soft for the work ahead. The trains that would follow weighed hundreds of tons and demanded real metal. Still, the event marked the beginning of a new age. A journey that had taken months by wagon could now be completed in days. Engineers analyzed the achievement in terms of gradient, fuel, and cost. The public saw it as triumph. Both were correct. The line had proved that no distance on land was beyond the reach of calculation and endurance. Chapter 5: Beyond One Continent. News of the American railway traveled quickly. In Russia, the Tsar's ministers commissioned surveys for a line from Moscow to the Pacific. In British India, planners began extending colonial tracks inland from the ports to control trade and movement. Every government wanted its own corridor of iron. The challenges varied. Siberia offered permafrost that melted into mud each summer. India offered monsoon floods and tropical heat that warped rails. In both cases, engineers had to adapt materials and techniques. Timber trestles were replaced with iron girders. Joints were designed to expand and contract with temperature. Local craftsmen learned the new methods and soon improved them. In the far north, bridges were built on floating foundations of stone-filled barrels to prevent collapse in thawing soil. In India, drainage systems were developed to carry away rainwater before it could undermine the embankments. The science of railway construction was evolving, with each failure corrected in the next mile. By the end of the century, steel tracks spanned continents that had been isolated for millennia. The railway had become not just a means of transport but a global system, a new infrastructure of empire and economy. For the engineers, it remained what it had always been, a series of problems to solve and a structure to keep standing against time. Chapter 6: Through Siberia. In 1891, Tsar Alexander III approved the construction of a railway that would link Moscow with Vladivostok. More than 9,000 kilometers of wilderness. It was the most ambitious transport project ever attempted. Engineers and surveyors traveled east by horse and sled, carrying measuring instruments in crates, frost-cracked glass lenses. Metal chains froze to their hands. Winter halted progress for months. In summer, the frozen soil thawed into swamps that swallowed entire wagons. The design of the line changed repeatedly as teams learned to build on permafrost. They laid thick beds of gravel to keep the heat from the ground and replaced wooden sleepers every few seasons. Supplies came by river and by ox cart. Communication with headquarters took weeks. Each new bridge demanded its own experiment, foundations that could survive both ice and flood. The cost in labor was enormous, yet the work continued. For the Russian Empire, the railway promised connection, defense, and prestige. When the final link opened in 1916, a traveler could cross the world's largest landmass without leaving the rails. It was an engineering triumph, measured not in speed but in endurance. Even today, parts of that original line remain in use. Testimony to calculations made with pencil and slide rule in a world of snow and silence. Chapter 7: Rails Under Empire. While Russia built across ice, Britain built across heat. In India, Africa, and Southeast Asia, the railway became the main instrument of colonial power. The stated purpose was development. The reality was control. Tracks were planned to move troops and resources quickly, not necessarily to serve local needs. Engineers brought European designs into climates for which they were never intended. They soon discovered that iron expands under tropical sun and contracts violently in monsoon rain. Bridges washed away, rails buckled, embankments collapsed. Adaptation became necessity. Indian engineers and artisans began to modify the imported standards. They introduced wider ballast layers, heavier sleepers, and better drainage. Workshops in Bombay and Calcutta produced their own locomotives by the 1870s. Knowledge traveled both ways, quietly undermining the myth of one-sided progress. Tens of thousands of laborers built the lines under harsh conditions, often barefoot, paid by distance laid. Yet those same lines later carried the trains of independence, leaders and relief convoys. Infrastructure built for empire survived to bind a new nation together. Chapter 8: Life Along the Line. A railway was never only iron and wood. It created its own moving society. Construction camps grew into towns, stations into markets. Every 50 miles, maintenance crews lived beside the track, responsible for its survival through heat, flood, and decay. Families settled in these outposts. Children learned to read by the light of signal lamps. Merchants followed the work crews, selling tools, food, and tobacco. Accidents were common, but so were celebrations when a new section opened. For engineers, the greatest challenge was continuity. Once a line was operational, it demanded constant attention. Ballast had to be tamped, bridges inspected, telegraph wires maintained. The work never truly ended. The railway also changed the concept of time itself. Before its arrival, each region kept its own noon. Schedules forced synchronization. Clocks were adjusted. Whole countries began to live by a common rhythm, standard time. A quiet engineering invention became one of the most profound social changes of the industrial era. Chapter 9. Machines of Precision. By the early 20th century, steam technology had reached its limit. Engines grew heavier and more complex, consuming vast amounts of coal and water. Designers searched for efficiency. Compound pistons, improved boilers, streamlined shapes. Every advancement came from experiment rather than theory. Railway workshops became laboratories. Engineers recorded pressure, vibration, and wear with new instruments. They discovered that the contact between steel wheel and steel rail could be modeled mathematically, a breakthrough that defined modern mechanical engineering. At the same time, electricity was entering industry. Electric trams appeared in cities, then electric locomotives on mountain routes where ventilation for steam was impossible. Signals evolved from manual flags to colored lights, controlled from central cabins. A network that once relied on human reflexes was slowly becoming automated. Despite these innovations, the human element remained. Maintenance crews still walked the lines each morning, listening for loose joints. Drivers judged speed by instinct, feeling vibration through the floor. The balance between man and machine held steady for another generation. Chapter 10. War on the Rails. When Europe went to war in 1914, railways became the arteries of conflict. Mobilization plans depended entirely on timetables. Trains carried soldiers to the front, ammunition to the guns, and wounded men back to hospitals. For the first time, strategy was written in departure times and freight capacities. Engineers adapted civilian networks to military use, building temporary sidings and portable bridges. In France and Belgium, new lines were laid overnight to supply the trenches. Trains were armored, guns mounted on flat cars, locomotives camouflaged with mud and canvas. The destruction was immense. Yet even amid war, technical progress continued. The need for efficiency accelerated research into diesel engines and stronger steels. After the armistice, these advances returned to civilian railways, shaping the interwar period of modernization. During the Second World War, the pattern repeated on a larger scale. Railways enabled invasion and resistance alike. Sabotage became a form of warfare, repair a matter of survival. By 1945, tracks crisscrossed every theater of battle, symbols of both logistics and vulnerability. Chapter 11. Reconstruction and Renewal. Post-war Europe lay in ruins, but its railways offered a skeleton on which to rebuild. Engineers assessed damage, replaced bridges, and electrified main routes. In the Soviet Union, the Trans-Siberian Line transported refugees and machinery eastward, preserving industry from destruction. In Asia, Japan's network was rebuilt with extraordinary speed, using lessons learned from wartime logistics. The 1950s marked the shift from repair to innovation. Diesel replaced steam on long hauls, reducing maintenance and cost. Standard gauge lines connected nations previously divided by incompatible systems. The concept of the international corridor was born. Economic recovery in Western Europe owed much to freight efficiency. Coal, steel, and agricultural goods moved faster than roads could allow. Railways were once again engines of stability, but this time without the flags of empire. Public attitudes changed as well. The train was no longer a symbol of conquest or conflict, but of continuity and a practical link between communities. Engineers found themselves responsible not only for movement, but for reliability, the quiet virtue on which modern societies depend. Chapter 12. The Age of Acceleration. By the middle of the 20th century, Trains had become symbols of national progress. In 1955, French engineers set a new world speed record with an electric locomotive, demonstrating that railways could compete with cars and aircraft. The achievement inspired a new vision, transportation that was fast, efficient and sustainable. Japan transformed that vision into reality. In 1964, the Shinkansen, the world's first high-speed railway, began service between Tokyo and Osaka. It combined precision engineering with exact scheduling, reducing travel time by half. The line was an economic success and a technical landmark. The Shinkansen's principles, light construction, continuous welded rail and advanced signaling, spread worldwide. France followed with the TGV, Germany with the Intercity Express, and later Spain, China, and South Korea with their own networks. Each generation of engineers improved on the last. Smoother tracks, aerodynamic designs, computer-assisted control. The modern high-speed train became not merely transport, but a system of coordination. Every bolt and circuit served one goal: to keep motion continuous, safe and predictable. For the first time since the 19th century, railways once again represented the cutting edge of technology. Chapter 13. Networks of a Global Age. As globalization intensified, railways regained strategic importance. Freight corridors linked ports to inland factories. Passenger lines connected megacities. Governments realized that a functioning railway was not a relic, but an advantage. In Europe, the Channel Tunnel joined Britain to the continent in 1994, a project that had been discussed for over a century. Its completion required international cooperation on a scale rarely achieved in civil engineering. 2 nations, 3 languages, and 1 unbroken line beneath the sea. The success marked a new era in transnational infrastructure. In Asia, China built thousands of kilometers of high-speed line within 2 decades, using domestic expertise to overcome geography as vast as that faced by the 19th century pioneers. The same principles applied: survey, grade, balance, tolerance, but with modern instruments and massive state investment. What had once taken a lifetime of work could now be planned and executed in a few years. Meanwhile, older lines were being revived for freight and regional travel. Countries rediscovered that rail could move people and goods with lower energy use and greater reliability than roads. The pattern of the 19th century returned, but with different motives: efficiency, sustainability, and climate policy. Chapter 14. The Mathematics of Motion. Behind every successful railway lies a quiet discipline: engineering mathematics. From the earliest days, calculations of gradient, curve radius, and load determined whether a train would run or fail. Those calculations have only grown more sophisticated. Modern engineers use simulations to model vibration, aerodynamics, and fatigue. They predict how steel expands in heat, how wind affects overhead lines, how braking forces distribute through axles. Yet the equations remain descendants of those first written in notebooks beside campfires more than 150 years ago. The basic idea has never changed: motion must obey physics. Every rail has an ideal curve, every wheel a limit of friction. Where early engineers guessed and adjusted, modern systems measure and compensate in milliseconds. This pursuit of precision defines the profession. Progress in railways has always been less about invention than refinement. Thousands of small corrections that together make speed safe. Chapter 15. Decline and Return. The second half of the 20th century brought competition. Air travel promised freedom. Highways promised convenience. In many countries, passenger trains declined as cars filled the roads. Old stations closed, tracks rusted, expertise faded. But the logic of energy and density eventually reasserted itself. Cities grew congested. Fuel prices rose. Environmental costs became visible. Governments rediscovered the efficiency of steel wheels on steel rails. In the 1990s and early 2000s, investment returned. Urban transit networks expanded. High-speed corridors multiplied. Freight operators turned to rail as the most sustainable way to move goods over land. The engineers who maintained the legacy systems found themselves once again at the center of national planning. Digital control systems, renewable power, and predictive maintenance became standard practice. The railway, so written off by many as obsolete, adapted instead. In the 21st century, its relevance is no longer questioned. It connects economies, reduces emissions, and defines modern infrastructure in the same way it once defined empire. Chapter 16, The Human Element. For all the machinery, the railway has always been human at its core. Behind the precision lies judgment. When to slow, when to inspect, when to repair. Automation assists, but it does not replace the experience of those who understand the sound and feel of moving steel. Engineers today work in offices filled with screens, yet they face the same questions as their predecessors. How do you balance cost and safety? How do you build something that will last a century in a changing climate? They inherit not only tools but a mindset, the belief that structure can overcome uncertainty. That faith built the first transcontinental lines, sustained the Siberian tunnels, and revived the networks of the present. The profession demands humility. Success is measured in what does not fail, the bridge that never collapses, the signal that always changes on time, the journey that arrives without incident, the passengers rarely notice. That is the engineer's reward and burden alike. Chapter 17, The Legacy. A line of steel across a continent is more than technology. It is a statement of intent. It says that humans are capable of linking what nature has divided. From the first surveyors on the plains to the designers of high-speed trains, each generation built on the quiet precision of the last. The global network of rails has shaped economies, wars, migration, and culture. It has altered landscapes and created nations. It remains one of the most influential achievements of applied science. Yet the names of those who made it possible, the surveyors, draftsmen, foremen, welders, and mathematicians, are largely forgotten. Their work surrounds us each day, the platform edge, the bridge overhead, the timetable on a screen. If there is a lesson in their story, it is that progress is not sudden. It is cumulative, a chain of effort linking the anonymous past to the functioning present. The first rails laid in dust and snow became the foundation of a connected world. The forgotten engineers built more than transport. They built a method of thinking, disciplined, persistent, exact. Their legacy endures not in monuments but in movement itself.